Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 800 for January 5th, 2020, as we start a new year and a new decade with a bit of a milestone to boot. Coming up in a few minutes.
You sit here with these two, and I've been so I flew in just for this. I was so looking forward to this, and it's like there's this instant. I love the men in the industry, but there's instant sorority that happens.
Well, there's so few of us.
Yeah. But there's more and more of you coming.
Yes, there is.
One of the best things about the last decade, whiskey-wise, was the emergence of women in distilling. Of course, women have been distilling whiskey for generations, but this was the decade where we went from seeing news releases with headlines like First Woman Named Master Distiller for Distillery X to ones like Distillery X names New Master Distiller without making a big deal about that person's gender. In other words, it's not perfect, but there's been a lot of progress. Bourbon historian Michael Veach brought together 3 women distillers for a recent Bourbon Salon evening at Oxmoor Farm in Louisville. Recently retired Michter's master distiller Pam Heilmann, Widow Jane's Lisa Wicker, and Joyce Nethery of Jeptha Creed Distillery. We had all 3 women on WhiskyCast individually during 2019, and you'll hear what happened when they sat down together over bourbons later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, your voice, January's Whiskey Club of the Month, and a whole lot more. All on this first episode of WhiskyCast for 2020.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. It's been a little more than 2 years since Diageo announced its plans to revive both the Brora and Port Ellen distilleries in Scotland. While construction work is already underway at Brora, it's only now just about to begin on Islay. Christmas week, Argyll and Bute Council finally signed off on planning permission for the Port Ellen project. It'll involve restoration work on the distillery's old buildings, along with an all-new still house. While no one from Diageo was available for interviews this week because of the holidays, project manager Georgie Crawford told us back in May that the plan is to not only replicate the stills from Port Ellen's final 2 decades, but bring back some of its past as well.
As we started to really look further back in the history of the distillery that was there, it started out in 1825, that actually it was quite a place of experimentation. We looked at the stories around how the first Scottish spirit safes were trialled and experimented with at Port Ellen Distillery, as well as the what we now refer to as the patent or Kofi still. Experiments were done again at Port Ellen Distillery and it made us really realise that through its different periods of production, it was a place of experimentation, and it was a distillery that was really looking to the future. And so we decided to bring some of that element into the new build. So although our main focus is still to make Port Ellen, actually we're going to be putting in a set of experimental stills to be looking to make experimental liquids for the future as well.
When Diageo announced the project in October of 2017, the plan was to have both distilleries back into production by 2021. No update yet on that timetable for Port Ellen following the lengthy planning approval process. That process is also holding up plans for what could become Islay's 11th distillery. Elixir Distillers is still trying to get approval to build a distillery just east of Port Ellen and has now spent more than a year on that process. The company is part of Specialty Drinks, which is owned by Sukhinder and Raj Singh, and resubmitted a new planning application last month after a series of public comments criticizing the original design. Company officials were not available for comment, but according to the application documents posted on the Argyll and Bute Council's website, architects redesigned the distillery to incorporate those comments and make the project, quoting now, more in keeping with the style of the south of the island. The new design is in a public comment period right now. A decision could be issued as early as this April. Last time around, we paid tribute to Al Young of Four Roses Bourbon, who died on Christmas night. We have another sad story to report this week. You probably are not familiar with Kevin McLaughlin's contributions to the whiskey world. The McLaughlin family owns Kelvin Cooperage in Louisville, which got its name from its original location on the River Kelvin in Glasgow, Scotland. Kevin moved the company to Louisville in 1991 to get more access to American oak and bourbon barrels, and Kelvin has since become a major supplier of barrels for craft distillers around the world. He died December 27th after a battle with cancer, just a few days after his 56th birthday. We do have word of a couple of new releases to start off the new year. Tullibardine is out with the 6th release in its Marquess collection, which honors Sir William Murray, the second Marquess of Tullibardine, and a contemporary of Bonnie Prince Charlie. The Murray 2007 is matured in ex-bourbon barrels. It's bottled at 56.6% ABV. No word on pricing. And from the craft distilling world, Chambers Bay Distillery in Tacoma, Washington, has released its first 5-year-old bottled in bond wheated bourbon. It's available at the distillery's tasting room on the shores of Puget Sound. I received samples of both whiskeys this week, and I'll have my tasting notes for them soon at WhiskyCast.com. Of course, that's where you can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Larceny Bourbon's heritage goes back to the days when Treasury Agent John E. Fitzgerald was patrolling the rickhouses of Kentucky, not just for the feds, but also for himself. He was stealing a taste of some of his favorite barrels of wheated bourbon on the side. Today's award-winning Larceny Bourbon has that same soft, smooth character Fitzgerald loved. Look for 92 proof Larceny Bourbon at your local retailer, and be on the lookout for the new limited edition release of Larceny Barrel Proof. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. The Harrow Whiskey Festival is this Friday and Saturday in Harrow Weald, England, just outside of London. The Arctic Whiskey Festival is Saturday in Tromsø, Norway, and Whiskey Wonderland 2020 is this Sunday in Long Beach, California. I think I know which one's going to have the best weather. The Edmonton MS Whiskey Festival is January 15th in Edmonton, Alberta, followed the next night by the Calgary MS Whiskey Festival. The Victoria Whiskey Festival gets underway that night in Victoria, British Columbia, and runs through the 19th. Once again this year, we'll have special coverage from Victoria that weekend, right here on WhiskyCast. The Brandy Library in New York City has a whiskey battle tasting that pits Scotch and Irish whiskeys on the 21st. Peggy No Stevens kicks off this year's Kentucky Derby Museum Bourbon Masters Series in Louisville, January 23rd. And the National Whiskey Festival is January 25th in Glasgow, Scotland. Of course, the 25th is also Robert Burns' birthday, and we have a bunch of Burns Night events going on all over the world at the end of this month. Check the calendar at WhiskyCast.com for a complete list. And if you're planning a Burns Night event and you don't see it on our calendar, just use the contact form at WhiskyCast.com to let us know about it. We'll be glad to add it to the list.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing. Pause and explore the silky smoothness of single pot still Irish whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock. Over the last decade, the number of women working as distillers has skyrocketed. Whether you want to use the terms master distiller, head distiller, or something else, it's no longer unusual to visit a distillery where a woman is in charge. During a recent Bourbon Salon at Oxmoor Farm in Louisville, Bourbon Hall of Fame historian Michael Veach brought together 3 of the bourbon world's leading distillers for a discussion on women in the distilling business. Pam Heilmann retired as master distiller at Michter's in 2019 after more than 2 decades at Michter's and Jim Beam. Lisa Wicker is now the head distiller at Widow Jane in Brooklyn, New York, and the consulting distiller for George Washington's distillery at Mount Vernon. And Joyce Nethery is the head distiller for her family's Jeptha Creed distillery in Shelbyville, Kentucky. We had individual interviews with all 3 women during 2019 here on WhiskyCast, but the Bourbon Salon was a chance for them to sit down and talk as a group, with Mike Veach leading the discussion.
You know, a lot of this actually goes back to Prohibition. When you come out of Prohibition, the distilleries learned very quickly either, hang together or hang separately. And I think that attitude is carried on more or less intact for, 80 years now, going on 90, close to 90 years later and such. Do you ladies find that same thing true? Do you think we're talking about production, not marketing? Marketing people are
no, they're cutthroat. They're cutthroat.
Yes, they're cutthroat.
They're cutthroat.
Cut from a different cloth.
Production, no. Do you still find that cooperation?
For sure.
And I'm particularly asking Lisa on this, being that her distillery is in New York. Is she?
Interestingly enough, I think even if I didn't have the Kentucky connection right now, I think it would be. I have been surprised at the people that have come to see me. I wasn't there when you came to see me, but no, it's not any different. People are just as curious about what I'm doing, where I'm growing my corn. It's not any different conversation than if I'm talking about the corn in Pennsylvania, if I'm talking about the corn, in upstate New York. I had an opportunity, recently to distill in another state, and it's the same conversation. It's just, a little bit more spread out. But no, it's not any different than everybody's got each other's back. It's really an interesting. New York's got the second largest number of distilleries in the United States. California's number 1. New York has 178 distilleries in it. And the previous owner had a little bit of had a few skeletons in the closet, but they've been very receptive. It took me I go to the New York State Distillers Guild meeting the first time. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how are they going to receive me? And all of them gave me a chance. And the second day, I sit down at the table. I feel like the girl in junior high school. I sit down at a table by myself, and all the prominent players sit down with me the next day. And we immediately after we got all those things out of the way, it was all shop talk the next day. And what are you doing? And can I come see you? And it's an interesting thing. I think that that I was a commercial winemaker before I was a distiller, and winemakers are great, and there was definitely this camaraderie, but nothing like distilling. Distilling, there's just none of us can keep a secret, but I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean it because nobody's like running to go grab somebody else's secrets and do something with them, right? It's just crazy.
There's just so many different things you can do in the process that it doesn't matter if somebody has your recipe, because they're not going to make it the same as you.
I always have the chickens. I have so many analogies. My chicken soup analogy. It's like you give somebody your chicken, your prized family heirloom chicken soup recipe. They're not going to source their chicken in the same place. They don't cut their chicken up the same way. Their carrots are bigger or smaller than your carrots. And so even if you give them that prized recipe, it's not going to turn out the same. Yeah. And so we all have our own style. We all have our own personalities and what we think is the right thing for us and our brand and our product. And
I've worked in several different industries in my life, big industries. You have as well. And never have I worked in an industry where someone who was a competitor would help me.
Yeah.
Never. I could call up Denny Potter tomorrow and ask him for a favor or ask him about a problem I'm having in my process. And he would help me. He'd probably come to my distillery if I asked him. I've known Denny since I was at Beam. We started at Beam together. And that's part of it. The people that are in the industry, 9 times out of 10, you've started with them somewhere. And you've worked with them somewhere along the line, either at one distillery or another, because nobody nowadays seems to stay at the same distillery. I mean, unless you own it.
Yeah, I think I'll be staying at Jeptha.
But yeah, that's, I mean, so you're friends. I mean, I have friends in, a whole bunch of different makers, Jim Beam, Heaven Hill. I mean, and they're friends, and they're willing to help you and do whatever you need.
Yeah, I've been totally amazed with the camaraderie and welcomeness, that we've been received with in the bourbon industry, from the production standpoint. When we opened Jeptha Creed, that week that we opened, we had people come and visit us from Wild Turkey and Four Roses and Woodford Reserve, and just people were just warm and welcoming and excited about what we were doing. And the term that I heard them using to talk about each other is frenemies. Everybody's a friend and gets along and helps each other, works really well together, and that it's not really till you get to the store shelf that things get really
right.
And Bill
the marketing salespeople are the ones that are. Yeah, we stay away from that. The marketing salespeople.
Bill Samuels actually and I were talking about this while we were on the American Queen one time doing a bourbon tour. He was saying that he really does hope that the small independent distilleries that are being formed now do come to him or somebody in the industry if they are having a problem, because volume-wise their competition is nothing. Jim Beam, like you said,
right.
You can take everything that Michter's, Jeptha Creed, and Widow Jane makes together in a year, and that's what 3 days production for Jim Beam. Yeah. Yeah. But what will hurt Jim Beam or Maker's Mark or anything else is if they start putting out really bad bourbon and start ruining the reputation of bourbon. So he wants to make sure that when they're making the whiskey, that it is good whiskey. Now, could you imagine that? Coca-Cola going to some small new independent cola manufacturer and having that attitude? Yeah.
When I first moved to Kentucky, I actually built a winery first in Marion County, and so I meet Steve Beam. That's who I end up distilling with eventually, right? And Greg Davis, who was at Maker's Mark at the time, right? And Greg, I end up having a conversation with him, and I'm having some trouble with all these white grapes because I build a winery around an established vineyard, and he called me. I had a question, and I kind of sent him a really formal email. And he just picked up the phone and called me. He's like, here's the deal. This is what you're going to have to do because I told him, I said, I could tell I'm fighting indigenous distillery yeast, not indigenous wine yeast. So if you're in wine country, there's all this wine yeast going on, right? But, and so I said, I like to let my white juice rest before I inoculate. He's like, oh no, honey, you're going to.
Oh no, honey.
Yeah. And I'm a lot older than he is. So he's like, oh no, honey, you're going to have to inoculate the before. And then we had an arson fire, unfortunately, at Limestone Branch way back. I don't know if you remember that or not. And the first person I called, because I'm going to try to save all the mash, right? And I called Greg. Same thing, silence on the end of the phone, but he was there and helped me make the decision about what to do, and broke the news to me I was going to have to trash all.
Right. I was just going to say, you didn't keep that.
No, he broke the news to me gently. But that was the thing that blew me away, was the fact that here he's the master distiller for Maker's Mark at the time, and he had the time to help me. And it's just amazing. And Stephanie Sherrick's here, and her father's my mentor, right? And he always, if he can't get to me right away, he always calls and it's like, is there an emergency? No, there's no emergency this time. But, he always follows up with questions and things like that. But he's so generous with his knowledge and everything. And it's just been amazing. I mean, I've been able to move on a pretty fast path, but it's because of all of the village that's helped me get there. Everybody's been so kind and generous with what they know. It's a pretty amazing place to be. And then there's you sit here with these two, and I've been I flew in just for this. I was so looking forward to this, and it's like there's this instant, I love the men in the industry, but there's instant sorority that happens.
Well, there's so few of us.
Yeah. But there's more and more of you coming.
Yes,
there is. When I first started, there wasn't anybody. And now it's real gratifying to see all the women, all the people. I mean, young people. Yeah. And it's great for me when I come in like today and go to the distillery. I love seeing all the young people and what they're doing and how they're doing it. And they all come up and they want to know this and they want to know that. Oh, I'm so glad you're here. I was going to email you, kind of thing. And it's fun. It kind of keeps you young.
I remember when I was with United Distillers. I guess this is probably 95 or so, 1995. George Dickel had a woman that was actually the woman that ran the still.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And
really?
It just amazed me that they didn't talk about that more, that they had a woman that was running the still, was in charge of making the cuts and, off the second distillation and such. And in a way, though, I kind of liked that because it wasn't because she was a woman. She was just good at what she did.
Right.
It didn't matter that she was a woman.
Yeah. Right. That's nice.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, we I'm sure all three of us get asked a lot, like, what's it like to be a woman working in a men's industry? And being in originally in the chemical industry as a chemical engineer, you're pretty much a woman working in a man's world. So it just kind of continues on. But, to have someone like that, being so distinctive and putting her touch on everything, that's just fabulous.
Yeah.
I think it's funny because I think everyone else sees that. I don't see that. And I'm sure these ladies don't either. When we were doing our jobs, I won't speak for you. When I was doing my job, it was, I'm just doing my job. I'm a woman, but I don't look down and look at that when I'm directing people and I'm trying to make product. I'm just doing the best job I can, no matter what industry it was in. And I think more other people bring that to light than we do ourselves. I don't think about that, to be honest.
I don't either.
So it's interesting. So Lisa, you've got a wine background. You've got a chemical engineering background. Pam, did you have a particular background before you started at Beam that got you in?
I always worked in manufacturing.
You worked in manufacturing?
Yeah, I worked 10 years actually in the agricultural industry, in manufacturing, agricultural equipment. Yeah. Then I worked 10 years in a steel mill. I was the only woman in both of those industries at the time. And then the steel mill actually transferred me down to Kentucky. That's how I got to Kentucky, to a magnetics plant in Elizabethtown. And my husband and I, they transferred us down, and that's how I got to Kentucky. And I left that industry to kind of divide and conquer, our finances, just to make sure one of us was always working in a different industry. And Jim Beam at the time was hiring tons of people. It was one of the swings of the bourbon, just a little uptick, and they were going to 6 days, and they were hiring all these people, and I heard they were hiring. I sent a resume, and they hired me like within a week. They wanted me to come right away and be a supervisor. That's what I always did. I was a management person. I have a business degree, and I actually am probably a couple credits shy of an education degree as well. I was going to be a teacher before I left upstate New York.
You made the right choice.
And then I changed. I did. This was much more fun.
Yes.
Bourbon is definitely more fun than teaching, because I did that too. I taught high school chemistry and physics for about 7 years after engineering. And a lot of times we joke, so that's where we got to loving bourbon.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But everything comes together, for a reason. Yeah. So as I kind of look back at my
career,
I was a process engineer for many years in distillation, distilling methyl methacrylate, which is a founding monomer for lots of different plastics and plastics additives. So as I look and think about that, if I'm distilling MMA for plastic, or if we're distilling ethanol for bourbon, the principles and applications, techniques are all very, very similar. But bourbon is a lot more fun.
It is.
Then I went to become a high school chemistry and physics teacher when my children were small, and taught the full range of students the whole time, and found the huge importance of classroom management skills. If you've got 30 teenagers in a room, I've found that applies when you've got a good large group of halfway drunken bachelors on a bachelor party.
Yeah, really.
Those same skills apply. Then I left.
Had a few of those. Have you?
Oh yeah.
Tastings.
Oh yeah.
I left.
Actually, the bachelorette parties are worse.
They are.
Actually,
the bachelorettes are sometimes worse.
I left teaching to become a chief financial officer when my husband and I started some other businesses. So they're boring stuff: accounts payable, accounts receivable, depreciation schedules. Yeah, you see, you made your face. Yeah, boring stuff, but hugely important.
Right.
Especially cash flow. Learned, the huge importance of all those business applications. So as I look back over my career, it's kind of serendipitous how all those things come together to be able to run the distillery now. They all apply to what we're doing.
I feel the same way. I've told people several times, I feel like I've been training for it my entire life, Yeah. My first real job was in a biology lab studying Drosophila, and
I don't know what that is.
Fruit flies.
Flies.
Yeah, I know you deal with those. Yeah.
Now I know what it is.
Yes, and so, but it's so interesting. People are like, how do you know all this stuff about Acetobacter transfer? I'm like, well,
let me tell you
about the little barbs on their little legs. But that being said, the same thing. I just feel like that some days I wake up and like all my life experience is just, it feeds into something that's practical.
Different parts of what you've done have helped in what you're doing now. And
Sounds like all three of us do the same.
Yeah. So my background was so varied. I did so many different things, different industries, different processes, and all of them. I mean, in the distillery, you have a whole bunch of different processes that come together. Besides distillation, I mean, a lot of people think, that's all there is distillation. That's not true. I mean, there is biology. Yeah. There is chemistry. There, all of that applies. And there is. And there is.
There's good luck.
Yeah.
Thanks to Michael Veach of the Bourbon Salon, along with Joyce Nethery of Jeptha Creed Distillery, Widow Jane's Lisa Wicker, and retired Michter's master distiller Pam Heilmann. By the way, the first Bourbon Salon of 2020 will be on February 4th at Oxmoor Farm in Louisville, and will focus on cooking with bourbon. We have a link for details at the WhiskyCast website. And that's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Mortlock, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlock lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. And let's start off with two of Lisa Wicker's recent releases from Widow Jane. By the way, you'll find my tasting notes for Michter's Whiskies by Pam Heilmann and Joyce Nethery's Jeptha Creed Straight Bourbon at the WhiskyCast website. Now, the 10-year-old Widow Jane bourbon uses whiskies from Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee that are blended in Brooklyn and cut with water from upstate New York's Widow Jane mine. It's bottled at 45.5% ABV, and the nose has notes of cocoa beans, dark chocolate, tobacco leaves, and molasses cookies. The taste has a thick, chewy mouthfeel with touches of black cherries, dark chocolate, muted spices, and a hint of oak tannins. The finish is medium length with a good balance of oak, spices, and black cherries. I'm scoring the Widow Jane 10-year-old bourbon a 92. Widow Jane The Vaults is a 14-year-old bourbon with whiskeys from Indiana and Tennessee. It's finished in American oak casks made from staves that had been seasoned for 8 years before being made into barrels, and it's bottled at 49.5% ABV. The nose is oaky with leather, tobacco, molasses, brown sugar, and roasted cocoa beans. The taste has notes of caramel candy, cherry cola, vanilla, and touches of clove and black pepper, along with molasses and dark chocolate in the background. The finish is long and subtle with hints of black cherries and lingering touches of spices and oak. I'm scoring Widow Jane The Vaults a 94. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute. First, though, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Rye whiskey was distilled by America's original risk-takers and history makers. Those first barrels of whiskey were bold, flavorful, and full of passion. Sagamore Spirit proudly picked up the torch with their spring-fed Maryland-style rye whiskey that celebrates the grit and glory of those patriotic ancestors who sipped their way into American history. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com to explore their award-winning spirit. Heaven Hill's debut release of Larceny Barrel Proof Bourbon hits retail shelves this month. It's a wheated bourbon in the Old Fitzgerald tradition and will be released several times a year. Batch numbers will be identified using the same code that Heaven Hill uses for Elijah Craig Barrel Proof, with a letter for the batch followed by numbers that represent the month and year. So batch A120 is the January 2020 release, and it's bottled at 61.6% ABV. You won't get that from the code. The nose is aromatic with notes of brown sugar, caramel candy, a hint of milk chocolate, muted spices, and a touch of oak. The taste is intense, but still well-rounded, with touches of black pepper and chili powder spices, complemented by sweeter notes of caramel candy, honey, brown sugar, and milk chocolate. Adding some water brings out touches of dried flowers and spearmint, and the finish is long with a good balance of lingering spices and sweetness. I'm scoring Larceny Barrel Proof Batch A120 a 93. And for transparency's sake, Heaven Hill is a sponsor of WhiskyCast. 61.6% ABV is a whopper of a spirit, but it's not the strongest one I tasted this week. One of the controversies we covered back in the early days of WhiskyCast was the dispute between Bruichladdich and the Scotch Whisky Association, which was upset when Mark Rainier, Jim McEwen, and the rest of the Bruichladdich team decided to try quadruple distilling some spirit the way it had been done back in the old days, when, as it was written back then, more than a sip or two could be lethal. That eventually led to Bruichladich's releases of the X4 single malts using the quadruple distilled spirit, and the distillery recently released a 10-year-old version of quadruple distilled Octomore. Only 3,000 bottles of Octomore X4 plus 10 were released at 70% ABV. It's the strongest whiskey Bruichladdich has ever released, and, by the way, it was peated to 162 parts per million of phenols and matured in a combination of bourbon, ex-sherry, and what the distillery is calling sweet wine casks. The nose is aromatic and well-rounded with touches of banana, coconut, citrus fruits, almond oil, and a nice maltiness with just a whiff of smoke. As you might expect, the taste is intense with spicy notes of chili powder, cinnamon, and clove, along with a heathery peatiness, mango, lemon zest, and almonds. I highly recommend adding some water to this one. It brings out notes of barley sugar, anise, and crystallized ginger. The finish? Long and slightly astringent, with a gentle peatiness and touches of coconut, almonds, and tropical fruits. You might expect a heavily peated whiskey at 70% ABV to be a one-trick pony, but this one defies that expectation. I'm scoring Bruichladdich Octomore X4 plus 10 a 95. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,750 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at WhiskyCast.com.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Time to announce our Whiskey Club of the Month for January. And congratulations to the Nanaimo Whiskey Club in Nanaimo, British Columbia. Mike Makarenko sent us an email to nominate his club, which has a blind tasting for its members each month. Mike told us in his email how they do their tastings, and this might be a useful tip if you're trying to come up with a format for your club's tastings. We score the whiskeys in 7 categories: appearance, nose, flavor, finish, body, balance, and integration. What's unique is the first whiskey is from the previous month, and it's interesting how the scores change. The second tasting is a new whiskey selected by the host for the month. After the 2 tastings, the host offers a few additional whiskeys for the club to taste and discuss. It's a great club, and we could use the glasses, as each member has to bring their own glasses to the tasting each month. Well, Mike, we can help with that. We're going to send you and your club 24 WhiskyCast Glencairn glasses to use at your club tastings. Now, if you're in a whiskey club and you'd like to be in the running for next month's Club of the Month honors, just use the contact form at WhiskyCast.com to get in touch with us. Tell us a bit about your club, and if you have a website or you're active on social media, we'll be glad to add a link to your club on our Whiskey Clubs page at WhiskyCast.com. Once again, congratulations to the Nanaimo Whiskey Club, our Whiskey Club of the Month for January, and thanks to our friends at Glencairn Crystal for supporting whiskey clubs around the world. Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, presented by Lot 40. Last time around, we closed out 2019 with my interview with the godfather of Australian whiskey, Bill Lark. David Taylor posted this comment on our Facebook page: "What a brilliant way to leave 2019, followed by 7 thumbs-up emojis. And Dan Woolley, a longtime brand ambassador in Australia, added, "What a bloody legend." On Instagram, Riley B. Henderson posted, "Great interview. I had no idea that Lark has been around since the early 90s. Last time around, I also shared my list of the top whiskey stories of 2019, and after we posted that story Monday at WhiskyCast.com, longtime Distilled Spirits Council executive Frank Coleman chimed in on Twitter with this comment: "In general, good list, but I think you missed one. Several sales of million-dollar whiskey bottles at auction in 2019, and the halo effect is strong on others at a time when rare wines are down and whole cases don't sell at that price point." Well, Frank does make a good point, and as I responded on Twitter, if you're a long-time listener, you probably know how I feel about the secondary market in general, especially with all of the reports of fake whiskeys being found on the auction market. In picking the stories for that list, though, I was trying to focus on those that had the most potential to impact average whiskey consumers. And if there really is a halo effect from these auctions that's affecting what average consumers are paying, then it's a story that probably should have been on the list. One of our annual New Year's traditions is asking you to share your choices for your final dram of the year and your first one of the new year. And we had plenty of responses on Twitter. @Whiskey Antiques said, "Going first footing tonight with the family, whose ancestors built Nakando Distillery, so it's only right that we will finish and start with Nakando Master Reserve 21-year-old. If you're not familiar with first footing, it's a Scottish tradition to guarantee good luck for the coming year, to welcome the first visitor after midnight, bearing gifts of coal, bread, and, of course, whiskey." Colin Sim at Distillery Bikes tweeted this, "We'll be at the Fireballs in Stonehaven, so last and first drams will likely be out of my hip flask if it lasts until the bells. In the flask will be Ardbeg 19. However, I will have a Springbank 10 first footing bottle in my backpack, so a more than able backup. #Happy Hogmanay." Mark O'Kern tweeted this, "Just received a bottle of Balvenie Single Barrel for Christmas. It may have to be the first of the new year. I always end the year with a Lagavulin 16. Chef Megan 101 in Atlanta sent along a photo of a Talisker 25 bottle that looks like it's seen better days, with the comment, "Tatter on the outside, warm on the inside." And I mentioned David Taylor a minute ago with his comment about Bill Lark. David is also based in Australia, and later in the week, he tweeted a photo of a bottle of Adams Tasmanian single malt with this comment, "To celebrate the birth of my grandson on New Year's Eve at 8:10 p.m. David, congratulations to your entire family. And I should note that we are watching the news of the horrific wildfires in Australia right now, and thinking of all of you down there. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always find us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at WhiskyCast, or just email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and all those other things that combine to make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. One of the things that often confuses whiskey newcomers is the regional designations within Scotch whiskey and how they're applied. For instance, someone who's been told to try Speyside single malts might miss out on a bunch of good options, since some are labeled as Highland single malts and others are just labeled single malt Scotch whiskies with no regional designation. The UK law currently governing the Scotch whiskey industry is known as the Scotch Whiskey Regulations of 2009. It only specifies that if a whiskey is labeled as coming from one of the 5 so-called protected areas of Scotland, then it must have been distilled in that area. It doesn't require that the region be listed on the label, though. There are only 5 protected areas, 2 localities, and 3 regions. The Isle of Islay, of course, is its own protected locality, along with Campbellton, which is actually defined as the South Kintyre ward of the Argyll and Bute Council on Scotland's 2006 elections map. The regions are the Highlands and the Lowlands. They're divided by a line that runs roughly from Greenock on the Firth of Clyde, northeast to the southern shore of the Firth of Tay. And then there's Speyside. It's a subset of the Highlands that roughly corresponds to the River Spey and the streams that feed into it. Officially, it's 8 wards within Murray Council and 2 wards within Highland Council's jurisdiction on that 2006 elections map. Whiskeys from within the Speyside region can be designated as either Speyside or Highland whiskeys, depending on which one the brand's owner wants to use. Now, there are unofficial designations you'll see from time to time. While a lot of websites will refer to whiskeys from Talisker, Highland Park, and other island-based distilleries as so-called island whiskeys, those whiskeys all officially fall into the Highland category. That's because the boundaries were drawn so that the Highland region's border continues from Greenock along the southern shore of the Firth of Clyde until it reaches the Irish Sea. As a result, all of the Hebrides Islands, as well as the Orkney Islands, are considered part of the Highland region when it comes to Scotch whiskey, except, of course, for Islay, and that also includes the Isle of Jura, even though Jura is so close to Islay that one could drive a golf ball over the channel between the two islands. It's not part of the Islay region when it comes to Scotch whiskey. Other unofficial designations say if a whiskey comes from a specific island or group of islands, it can be labeled with that name. For instance, Highland Park refers to its whiskeys as Orkney single malts, and that's perfectly legal. It also avoids repetition. Imagine trying to say Highland Park Highland Single Malt Scotch Whiskey 3 times really fast. If you really want to get into the specific details, we've posted a link at the WhiskyCast website to the Scotch Whisky Association's document that offers guidance for the industry on how to comply with the regulations. If you have something you'd like us to look at on a future episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com, along with links for our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast, the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the whiskey photo of the week, our calendar of events, and, of course, a complete archive of past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. We'd love to hear from you. You can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at WhiskyCast, and the email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2020, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.